Hi folks, welcome to another episode. In this episode, we're talking to James Wright, a building archaeologist. We start off by looking into James's bit of his history and his background and how he got into building archaeology. And then we go on to tease a bit more out about him in terms of some of the grand building he's done to some of the smaller historic buildings and the lessons that he's learned from those. We talk about some of the science involved in building archaeology, so dendrochronology and the tree ring analysis and how that works and how he uses that. And then some of the other investigation techniques and the technology that's used. We then talk about reusing of building materials and how that can throw you off the scent of a particular building in its age and its legacy. But then from us homeowners, it's then some of the steps about where to start with understanding your own building and the things that you can do, and some of the resources that homeowners can use to research their own building's history. We then cover some of the myths, which is all about the book that James has written. For example, the myth of reusing ship's timbers. And then finally, as with every episode, we wrap up with some of James's favourite books, his favourite building, and then a bit about how to contact James. We think it's a really good episode, this one. Very engaging. Hope you enjoy it. Do let us know. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode, and very excitingly in this episode we've got with us James Wright, a building archaeologist, and I'm going to talk a little bit about James and introduce him and all about things building archaeology, myth busting and so forth. So I'm going to dive straight in and embarrass James with a bit of a chat all about him. Are you ready, James? Do stop me at any point and say, that's utter nonsense, stop lying about me, but there we go, we'll go in.
I'll debunk myself.
Exactly, yeah. So James has been involved in the world of archaeology for over 20 years. He began his career following graduating from the Department of Archaeology at the University of Nottingham, working for Trent and Peak Archaeology, prior to retraining as a conservation stonemason under the master mason Mark Stafford. After working as a stonemason for a number of years, James then combined both disciplines as archaeological and historic buildings assistant with Nottinghamshire County Council between 2004 and 2010. And this is where he ran the Castles of Nottinghamshire project. James then returned to the University of Nottingham as a doctoral researcher in a collaborative doctoral award with the National Trust on Tattershall Castle in Lincolnshire, and also during that time he was also teaching other undergraduates in the Department of Archaeology. So James has actually worked for several years in the heritage sector with experience as a field archaeologist, a conservation stonemason, a community archaeologist, historic stone specialist, archival researcher, historic graffiti specialist, that would be something I'd be interested in picking up on a bit, and a buildings archaeologist. His principal interest is in buildings archaeology, and in 2020, James began writing the medieval Mythbusting blog. Now that seeks to investigate and debunk some of the commonly believed and repeated stories about ancient buildings, and we know on this audience, we've all heard several of them, so we'll cover a bit of that here. Now that led to this book, which is the Historic Buildings Mythbusting, and I actually had the pleasure of meeting James recently during the book tour of going through this book. So we'll cover some of the bits on that book. Welcome, James, to the podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time to have a chat with us. Why don't we start off with how much of that did I get right and how much did I get wrong and anything I missed out?
You got it right, because I think you've been on my my CV on my website.
Nonsense. No, not at all.
So I can sense some of the things that I've said myself on there. But the only thing that wasn't mentioned is that I spent nearly 6 years working for the Museum of London Archaeology as a buildings archaeologist, where I got the opportunity to work on all sorts of really well-known properties, such as the Tower of London, the Palace of Westminster, Southwark Cathedral, the London Guildhall, Knowle, a whole bunch of quite well-known high-status properties, which really sort of helped on my career and opened quite a lot of doors for me. So that was about the only thing that was sort of missing from there. And I did that between, 2011 and 2016. So that was between leaving Nottinghamshire County Council and coming back to do my PhD research. But that was about the only thing that was off there.
Yeah, I deliberately left that out because I thought that'd be nice something for you to champion yourself, because they are some pretty epic buildings, aren't they, in terms of the things you get to work on. So how do you take a big building like that, which is like of grand strategic or grandiose stature, and then take the lessons that you learn from those into the regular old historic house, in terms of what are the lessons that can be learned from that, or how do you understand the building?
Well, ultimately, the techniques that we use as buildings archaeologists are pretty much the same, regardless of the structure. Now, we might weight some parts of it data gathering in slightly different ways. We might spend longer on more complicated projects or projects which require a greater level of detail. But ultimately, I think that from the beginnings of buildings archaeology as a proper discipline within the heritage world, which starts in the late 80s, early 90s, we would still be approaching the structures in more or less the same way. So we are looking essentially for data capture to gain as much information as possible while we're there on site. This can be quite lo-fi in truth. So a lot of what I do isn't sort of laser scans or machines that go ping or anything like that. I'm really quite lo-fi. So I'm turning up on site with a piece of plain A4 on a clipboard with a pencil and a rubber, because the rubber is the most important piece of equipment on site, really. You can rub out all of your mistakes, pretend that you didn't say them.
Yeah.
So essentially, it's writing down your observations of the built environment as you see it on site when it is there right in front of your eyes, that kind of first principle, getting the information down. Now, you might disagree with yourself at a later period, don't always get things absolutely correct on site, but probably 80-90% of what will eventually go into your reporting or your article or your book will be gathered there on site and then refined later on. So you're literally writing down observations of things such as, well, we would start really with the form and the function, the fabric and the materials, the setting and the context, and of course the dating and the phasing. Those are things that we want to get down on paper. And we can also harness drawings, whether they be plans, elevations, sectional elevations, details, sketches, whatever they happen to be, again, to capture that information in a visual record. And then I think obviously using photography as well, both general and detailed, and in fact macro in some cases as well. So it's about bringing home all of that data. Now, there might be other opportunities for gathering slightly different sorts of information as well, because one of the great things about buildings archaeology is we're not afraid to be multidisciplinary. So we can use all the tools in the toolkit. And I suppose the other two principal styles of data capture would be going into the archives and looking for the written word, the drawn word about the building that you're surveying. Now, this might include looking in diaries or newspaper articles which refer to the building or the lives of the people who have inhabited or worked at or been involved with the structure. It can involve things like maps and plans and diagrams and drawings of the building, photographs, of course. It can include title deeds, who bought it, who purchased it, who rented it, when was that? And of course, building accounts, if they exist. Now, they might not be the original building accounts for the construction of the project, but there might be accounts of remodeling, that kind of thing. So there's all sorts of information that we can gather from the archives. And then also, we can sometimes call in our colleagues, the dendrochronologists, to get some scientific tree ring dates to really help us to focus the specific date of a property as well, but not just the original build, the primary phase, but also any of the remodelings and insertions that have gone on as well. So those techniques, we have the ability to throw them at any building, whether it's a very, very complicated palace such as Knoll down in Kent near Sevenoaks, which to my mind has the most complicated buildings archaeology of any structure that I've ever looked at. Firstly, it's absolutely massive, and secondly, because it's been remodeled on so many occasions, the scale of the thing is also complicated by the amount of times that it's been fiddled with and interfered with and changed and altered over the time. But we would use the same techniques to record that as we would a small 3-bay domestic late medieval hall house lived in by an artisan or a yeoman farmer, something like that. We would still approach it in the same way, but we might go to a different level of detail on certain aspects of the recording.
You just touched on dendrochronology then. Very fortunate that I've had dendrochronology done on my home, so I know how it works. But just briefly, for a benefit of our audience, can you just explain how that works in terms of the tree ring dating? Because I think it'd be quite interesting.
Yeah, sure. So dendrochronology is the oldest and really most respected of the scientific dating techniques that we use within buildings archaeology. And it involves taking a core out of a piece of timber within the house. You have to have analysed the building to ensure that that is part of the primary phase, that it's made from green oak originally when it's converted and put together. We can't be looking at something which has been reused from another building, because that will date the original structure rather than the structure it's in. So we have to be pretty sure of it. But we're then looking for a little bit more. So we want a piece of timber which has got at least 55 growth rings, so the statistics work. We also want something which has preferably the bark still surviving, or if not the bark, which is obviously the last year of growth, then the layer of sapwood, which is right underneath the bark, which is known as the waney edge. Or if we can't quite get those ideal circumstances, i.e. the year that the timber was felled precisely, we'll then be looking for an amount of the sapwood, which is the tissue which was still alive during the period when it was felled. Now, the sapwood in oak, and we are only really looking at oak here. The other species that are used in building don't tend to be datable. The sapwood will tend to be much lighter and slightly spongier, and it's where the sort of the worm tend to get into. So it's often pockmarked by these little beastie holes and the like. And we're going to be looking at that, and that might give us a felling range, because sapwood will grow for between 15 and 40 years. So as long as you've got some of that, and you can see that clearly, and you can get the dendrochronologist core drill into that space to withdraw a sample, then you've got a reasonable chance of then, after the processing of the timber, being able to match the growth rings to the known chronologies. So the growth rings, the way that they work is that you've got this sort of two periods of growth in a year. In the summer, the growth rings are going to be wider, and in the winter, the growth rings are going to be much narrower. And that's as a direct result of the environment at the time. Now, the environment overall within the locality, within the region, acts as a fingerprint. So the growth rings essentially are only going to be like that in that particular region, according to the environment at a particular time. And those fingerprints can be sensed from tree to tree. So as long as the trees have all grown in the same region, they will be experiencing more or less the same growth on that annual cycle. And you can polish up the timber, and you can put it up against your database of other known trees, stretching all the way from the modern age all the way back, overlapping one after the other. You can go right the way back into prehistory with this, as long as you've got the samples. And because there are these databases which look at trees across the country, we can then offer up the sample and say, well, actually, this fits within this period of time. And oh, look, we've either got a felling range, or we've in fact got a felling date. Now, sometimes it doesn't work. There are all sorts of variables. So if you've got trees which are grown in an open parkland, it's unlikely to show up statistically, because the growth rings are going to be so even. That does sometimes happen. It will depend on whether or not you've actually got sufficient numbers of growth rings to begin with. So if you haven't got 55 growth rings in any of those timbers, you're not going to get a date. Have you got sapwood or the bark or the waney edge present? What kind of condition are the timbers in? So if they have been really, really infested with beasties, then that might lead it to just not having the integrity any longer. The information's gone. If it's particularly damp and rotten, again, the information might not be there as well. Sometimes, for reasons better known to the trees themselves, a date just doesn't come out of them. So it's not a guarantee. Just because you've got a piece of timber, you can't guarantee that it will date. But when it does happen, sometimes you do get those remarkable dates. And I know you've just said that you've had yours dated.
Yeah.
I'll be interested to hear a little bit about that in a moment. But one of the things I will say is that I spent some time working on a farmhouse 4 years ago in Worcestershire, and I'd come to a conclusion by looking at all sorts of bits of data that a particular build of the property, phase 2, which was timber framed, probably dated to 1600 to 1650 on stylistic grounds. So the way it was put together, the features that were there, the sort of things that we would expect in that first half of the 17th century. And then the client then brought in the dendrochronologist, and you can imagine how my heart was pounding
Yeah,
when
right.
that PDF dropped in my inbox. Am I about to be exposed as a fraud? Is buildings archaeology actually, a bit of a con trick? And I opened the PDF, and lo and behold, there was the scientific date. They had got a felling date. They'd not just got the year; they'd even got the season that this thing was dropped. So the timber was dropped in the spring of 1651.
Oh,
So technically, I was 6 months. Technically, we do know, because of the nature of historic building traditions within carpentry, that they didn't hang around. They felled the tree, they converted it, and they built almost immediately. They were not stockpiling, they were not seasoning. That all happens much later during the industrial period and afterwards. We can see this from the building accounts. So the date of felling is tantamount to being close enough to the date of construction. So really within 6 to 12 months, you can be pretty sure that that building has gone up. So when it works, it's a pretty precise technique.
No, thank you, James. I love the science behind it. That's the thing. So there's the geek in me that sort of loves this science combined with, like you say, the sort of the very much the more. I mean, how would you describe it? It's more of I guess, an art form, I suppose, in trying to recognise stylistic features in a sense. And then you've got the real science in terms of you cannot dispute this when you've got a good reference chronology that you can go against, sort of saying that is the date. So yeah.
So what was the date of your property then?
So my property was built in two halves. So the half that I'm in at the moment, we got some dendrochronology back that dated it to 1400 and something, but almost certainly reused timber, because you've got different mortises and joints and all sorts of other things. So Andy Moir that came out and did the dendrochronology here, looked at stylistic features and went, actually, yes, this dates to this time, but we can't guarantee that this side of the house was built then. The other side, however, 1731, the winter of 1731 is when they reckon that was built. It's absolutely incredible. I mean, it's 1731, maybe 1732, worst case scenario, but there were 4 timbers there, all dated the same. We're like, that is bang on. And all the stylistic features, like you say, married up with that sort of chart in terms of sort of saying somewhere between 1700 and 1750-ish. And I was like, that is amazing. I love that science that sort of brings it all together. So yeah, brilliant.
And I think dendrochronology as well, as a science, has really come on leaps and bounds. So when I started in buildings archaeology in the very, very, very late 90s, it was still, if not in its infancy, then it was still at middle school. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
And the chronologies and the data sets really hadn't expanded to the extent that they have now. And we've now got them freely available online via the Vernacular Architecture Group, so that we can actually check if we're in a building, say, in, let's say for sake of argument, we've got a crown post roof in Nottinghamshire. Well, we can actually get a sense of what the earliest known crown post is and what the latest known crown post is from the dendrochronology. And that really helps us stylistically. So if we are in one of these crown post buildings within the county where I live, Nottinghamshire, I would know that I am somewhere between the very beginning of the 14th century and, say, the 1460s, 1470s. So we'd be looking at something between about 1310 and 1470. So it helps to triangulate just by knowing the style of the feature that you're trying to date stylistically, because we've now got these dendro dates. And that's really come on, because stylistic dating essentially before the 21st century was much more inaccurate, and the dendrochronologists have helped us to refine that technique.
As you may know, I'm a building surveyor, so most of my working life has been advising people hoping to buy a historic building, or they've bought it and they want to repair it. I got into conservation in the 80s and early 90s. I remember the first dendro occurring and how excited everyone is. That's how old I am.
Sorry to interrupt, but really quickly, just want to cover 2 points. One is we'd love some feedback on this, and both on this episode and others. And actually, you can do that by tapping somewhere along here, the thumbs up icon. That's a like for this particular video, if this is the kind of content you enjoy watching. The other one is, well, the analytics we get from these videos. We can identify that many people watch the videos but aren't subscribed to the channel. If it's quite okay, if you could subscribe to this channel, it just helps us generate and create more content like this by growing the channel. And actually, if you subscribe, you get notified as well if you tap the little bell icon of the next video that upcomes. So if you can do those two things for us right now, that'd be brilliant. Right, back to James.
But yeah, the one thing I've said for years to people is the most important thing before you launch to do anything is understand your building. Understand what it is, what it's built of, how it's developed, and therefore the significance of bits and pieces. Now, you mentioned when you were talking, you used the example of Noel. There, you say you go in with your clipboard and everything, and it's just that first hit almost. But I've been into many properties, and I know you would have done as well, where there's lots of things that are covered up.
Mm-hmm.
And how often do you find yourself saying, well, look, we need that uncovered to investigate? Or have you found that the clients have already uncovered it? How do you deal with that sort of thing?
I think there's many variables at play here. The first thing to say is that please, 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 please don't start taking hammers and chisels to listed buildings at all. Certainly not until you've got listed building consent. So it very much depends on the nature of the project. So if we take the example of Noel again, this was a very, very big, ongoing, cyclical conservation project which the National Trust were administering. There was many moving parts. And the trust had decided that they wanted to embed archaeology within the conservation work from the onset of the project. And essentially, we would go in just at the point where we could see something useful. So, for example, when we started off on the project at Knoll, it was all about the roofs, because they wanted to get the building essentially watertight before they started thinking about the interiors and then the collections within the house as well. So it was a first principle, really, make sure that there isn't water pouring in through the roofs. So we went in just after the contractors had removed all of the tiles. Or in fact, we were going along because they were doing that cyclically, because you don't want the whole thing off, even though it was a canopied roof over the top. So it was actually pretty safe and secure, but they were doing it in a certain order. So we would go in, record the timbers as they were exposed. So that's one way that one can do it. You're doing it almost like a watching brief. So as the works occur, you're there on site recording what is exposed. And certainly we would have been able to see things that we would not have seen had the tiles been on, because some of those roof structures were completely inaccessible from the interior. Or when you did see them on the interior, you didn't see the rafters. You would only see the principals, and in some cases you wouldn't even see the principal trusses. So by nature of it being a stripped roof, you do see so much more. Now, let's look at another example. Many times I go and work on sites where it's a research project for a landowner who just wants to find out more about the property that they live in. So there's no invasive works going on at all. It's not part of conservation or a planning application or anything like that. It's just the building as it's lived in. And in most cases, I'm seeing that, and there's plaster everywhere, and you suspect that there might be timbers underneath the plaster which are not exposed. So there, much as we might like to see the bones of the house, it would be completely inappropriate to start invading and chopping plaster away, etc., particularly without listed building consent. But also there was no need to do so unless there was a conservation requirement. So on some occasions, you just have to come away saying, well, I can't see the bones of the house there, so I can only comment more generally, more broadly, but there's probably timber framing under there, or there might be brickwork under there, etc., etc. So sometimes there is that frustration. And then sometimes you get a kind of a halfway house. So again, going back to a building that I mentioned just a few moments ago, this property in Worcestershire, this farmhouse, which I saw right at the beginning of the pandemic, actually, in March of 2020. I saw a building which a contractor had been working within the property and had stripped away some of the covering. So a lot of the plasterwork was gone as a result of some interventions. And in many respects, I saw that building at the perfect point. Because if I'd seen that prior to any works, I might have identified about 4 or 5 building phases to it. It was a very complicated farmhouse, 4 or 5 building phases if the plaster was all still on. But with the plaster being removed in quite a lot of the areas, I spotted 9 building phases. So essentially, the way that a house is lived in can often mask the information. But it must be said that in terms of how these houses were originally used, we see a lot of timber framed houses which are essentially Victorianized, where they do strip off the plaster to reveal the timbers beneath or reveal the stonework beneath, because there was a fetishization of the building materials in that period. A lot of it was being egged on by medievalism and romanticism and kind of showing the buildings almost as lived in ruins. And that kind of has affected our modern view of buildings, and lots of people do like to have exposed timbers, exposed stonework, exposed brickwork in their properties, when that would never have historically been the nature of them. So in many respects, when I do go into a property and I am confronted with exposed timbers, that in terms of the grand scheme of the historicity of how these buildings would have appeared, that's actually a luxury. So I have to make the best of what I am given on the site that I turn up to, but no two are going to necessarily be the same.
So just on that one about a landowner wanting to understand the history of their building, I've spent the last sort of 7 or 8 years restoring my home. It's now got to the point of going, great, I've got some paint on the walls, and I'd now kind of love to invite you over and sort of say, great, can you come and give me some history on the house? You'd be like, well, that's lovely, but if you invited me over several years ago, I could have done a damn sight better job before you put all the plaster back on the walls. Okay, so that's a good one to learn then for anyone doing a restoration, is when they've at the stage of doing some of the strip out, or at least some of the work they're doing with consent. That's the time to get you involved. Then that's really useful.
Well, I mean, if the project has been managed effectively and it is a listed building, then the conservation officer is likely to have requested buildings archaeology.
Okay.
And if not, an actual record just immediately prior to works, or even with a watching brief, then they would almost certainly have requested a heritage statement or a statement of significance, or one of those many sort of planning documents, just to try and get a gauge on what the building is and how complex it is and what its significance is, to actually inform the conservation officer in their decision making. Because even with a site visit, they're not going to be able to spot absolutely everything, and they want to make sure that they're getting their decision making absolutely correct. So sometimes at that early stage, they will request one of these heritage statements, an assessment of the building, which will then inform, and they'll be able to say, well, actually, now we know that this wing over here is really potentially 14th century rather than 18th century. So we would like to see a nice level of record with a good watching brief to ensure that we've got a proper record of that prior to all of the works occurring and during the works. So fingers crossed, if the landowner is engaged with the conservation officer and it is all being done legally, then the archaeology should be embedded anyway. However, we know that in the real world, that has often been completely overlooked. And I certainly go to these sites quite frequently and see interventions which have been made within my own lifetime. I'm in the second half of my 40s, which have been done potentially without listed building consent. Therefore, the landowner was legally culpable for that work. And the fines can be quite significant. And in the more egregious instances, there is also a prison sentence. So this is not an encouragement to landowners to start mucking around with listed buildings. You don't want to get yourself into that kind of trouble.
One of the things when I was in practice, I did a lot of expert witness work. So I've been involved in some of those cases myself, on both sides, actually. But anyway, just picking up on some of those things. The first thing, taking Rich's point, is that if you've got a good conservation surveyor or architect involved, then they should be bringing all the right parties together at the right time. So perhaps the key is, if you're doing it yourself because you're trying to save money, you often don't save money because you end up in trouble later down the road. So, it sometimes pays to get the right team involved at the very beginning.
It must be said that buildings archaeology is not particularly expensive in the grand scheme of things either. We don't tend to charge very, very high day rates, certainly not in comparison to a surveyor or an architect, or even, to be honest with you, in comparison to your carpenters and your stonemasons. Like, our day rates tend to be quite low. And the amount of work required within buildings archaeology doesn't tend to be too labour intensive either, certainly not in comparison to our below ground colleagues, where you are looking at really quite large amounts, because there's so many days required on site for digging, and then so many days analysis afterwards, and so many days for write-up. Buildings archaeology tends to be a lot more streamlined. And yes, there are the more expensive projects where we have to go in and make a full record of the building, but it's still, by comparison to many other disciplines, and even within our own discipline, doesn't tend to be particularly off-putting in terms of the expense.
I'd echo that. When I was in practice, I mean, for the smaller projects, we did it ourselves. I mean, we were capable of doing a certain amount ourselves. I mean, for information, back in the day when I was a teenager, I actually took part in the archaeological excavation at Mucking in Thurrock. That was back in the 70s, it was. And I used to go and mess around at Passmore Edwards, helping sorting finds and things. In fact, I nearly went into archaeology instead of surveying. So it's always been in my heart, history, archaeology, I've always loved. So it's something we used to do. But going back to the point, we knew where our limits were. And there were quite a few times we were dealing with buildings we knew that it was beyond our, and then we brought in the archaeologists, to say, look, we need you because this is beyond our scope. But it's also depends on the scope of the work. If you're doing a minor project on a building, and you only need a small heritage statement for a limited amount of work, that's one thing. It's when you're making major changes that you really need the right people in. Well, you always need the right people, but it's how far do you go? And I can assure you that getting a good archaeologist in at the right time really does pay for itself. Can I just go back, though, to some basic investigation things? Earlier, we were talking about opening up and what have you, and totally agree with you. Don't do it without consent. But I have found that different officers view that differently. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, you've told me about it, get on with it, we'll keep a record of it, but we don't need a formal application for the initial opening up. Others will want an application for, just to look at the thing. So that can vary. So get to know your officer, I suppose, get to know your region. But one of the things I've found useful in recent years is thermography, using thermal imaging. It does depend on temperature differential, so it doesn't always work. But the number of times I've got a timber frame, rendered, plastered, you can't see a thing, you put thermal imaging on it, and all of a sudden you can see the frame. Or you think, oh, is that a brick wall? Put it on. No, it's modern block work, or it's clay lump or something like that. So all these bits of kit are going to help people like you in future, or do you see it as a hindrance? How do you view those sort of things?
I don't really feel that we really need to throw huge amounts of technology at the job. It can be done, but it tends to massively increase the costs. And one of the attractive elements of buildings archaeology for most people is that it doesn't cost a great deal. Yeah. So throwing those extra techniques at it, they can be useful, but that sort of work tends to be reserved for research projects, highly funded research for research's sake. It might be tied to a conservation project, but it tends to be the sort of thing that only really universities are doing. And it is certainly way beyond the remit of the work that I do, and way beyond the necessity of what's being asked for. I've certainly never been involved in that element of work myself, and it's never been requested. As much as has ever been requested of a conservation officer, which involves something more science-based, has been the requests for dendrochronology. So in my experience, it's people like Chris Brooke at the University of Nottingham who is doing exactly what you've just described, but it doesn't tend to be something which is being requested as part of a buildings archaeology survey. I can certainly see the value and use of it, but it's whether or not that can be harnessed to the budget of the project. And usually there will be a hard limit for people on those budgets as well. So
Yeah,
calling
yeah.
in that extra stuff tends to be quite rare. And again, when we have used laser scanning to actually produce drawings, whether they be actually 3D models of the buildings or spaces, or just laser scanning to then produce the point cloud for plans, elevation, sectional elevations. Again, that does tend to be incredibly expensive to call in those surveyors to hire that kit in, and it's relatively rare. Certainly since I've gone self-employed, that has not really come up. Mostly I'm using drawings which have been already created, already provided, rather than me having to commission them. When I do need to actually produce a drawing myself, I can do that with fairly low tech stuff again, using hand tapes and 30-meter tapes and distos, and creating the grid to then put the building plan on. And again, it doesn't take that long. Of course, if it's a massive building and it's hugely complicated, then yes, we would have to think again. But those hugely complicated and very large buildings tend to come with larger budgets anyway. But in the main, as I say, that certainly from my experience, buildings archaeology tends to be relatively inexpensive and relatively lo-fi. Now, I'm not speaking for all buildings archaeologists, but I am saying within the limits of my own career. And I've certainly been involved in those big projects when I was working at the Museum of London Archaeology, where we certainly did call in geometricians to actually provide laser scans for 3D things, models of places like Knoll, for example. And we also used that at Bastion 13 on the London City Wall, which is one of the medieval towers which survives opposite the old Museum of London, in fact. There, though, I will say that the laser scan itself did show some limitations, because as good as the technique is, if the scanner can't actually see or bounce back off the physical structure, then you're not going to get the data. So there, the scanner was unable to pick up a reading on a very steeply angled window recess. Essentially, this was the embrasure for a window, and it couldn't hit it and bounce back the data. There was another bit of the actual wall of the bastion where it was entirely hidden behind two bushes. And again, they couldn't get the data there as well. And the bushes were so close to the wall that they couldn't set up the instrument to be able to get that data. So Muggins here had to go in with his drawing board and then actually manually draw those spaces. And then those spaces were then inserted into the digital image. So again, there are always limitations, as I sort of expressed with dendrochronology. The system doesn't always work, and you've always got to then come back to being able to draw on a drawing board. So those really old techniques that I was learning in the 90s still prove useful through to this day. You have to know how to do it manually before you can successfully do it digitally.
So in the world of AI, I guess, and robots, your job's fairly secure for the foreseeable future, then, you think?
I think so, but I look at AI results on internet search engines all the time, and people are trusting that data, and I'm looking at that data, and because it's only based on the information that's available, quite often the information that's available about historic buildings is wildly incorrect.
Right.
And so AI will only regurgitate that wildly incorrect information. And it does take the interpretation of a buildings archaeologist. Essentially, I said earlier in a very flippant way that the most important piece of equipment on site is a rubber, because you can rub out when you're wrong. But in reality, the most important piece of equipment on site is the human brain filtered through the human eyes. You can take as many laser scans, as many photographs, as many thermal images as you want, but unless you've got the training and skill to know what you're looking at, you've got no information at all. In fact, you've got rather too much information, but you're not able to filter it. You're not able to understand how the building developed. So one of the things that I'm really, really interested in is castles. Now, castles don't come up for survey all the time, as you might imagine. I probably do one about every 18 months, something like that. Sometimes it's a little bit more, sometimes it's a little bit less. In fact, I haven't done one at all this year. But what really interests me in castle studies is trying to explain why a castle no longer looks like it did in its medieval heyday. Because so many of these buildings are now ruinous or semi-ruinous, or have just got a little bit of their property which is now being lived in or used in a meaningful sense. So how does a building go from one thing to another? Well, again, it's only interpretation and the use of lots of different elements of data which can explain that story. And just to give a real world example of that, I did a survey 3 years ago of Greasley Castle Farm, which is just outside Nottingham. This would have originally looked something like Haddon Hall in Derbyshire, one of the most impressive great houses of the late medieval period. It still looks the part up on its crag there. It's used as a film set so often. It looks like a proper castle-y castle, if you like. But Greasley, which once looked like that, is now really quite a ramshackle farm. And so the skill is trying to understand how it went from one thing to another thing. And it's only really the interpretation of the human brain filtered through the human eye and the training and the experience that can make the observations and can start to bring about the explanation. And of course, you have to throw in the archival history of the building as well. So there's all sorts of issues there. Just to sort of give the story away, what happened is that the family died out. And the site was passed on to their cousins. Their cousins then picked the wrong side at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Henry VII took exception to that, took the site off them, gave it to one of his retainers. The retainer had already got lots and lots of his own sites, which were presumably quite expensive to run. By this point, Greasley Castle was quite old-fashioned, so it's left. It's starting to become to rack and ruin. Then they think, well, we could make a few quid out of this, so we'll tenant it out. Farmer gets installed, starts making changes, moving the walls around, dropping bits of masonry here, there, and everywhere. And it stays as a tenant farm up until the 19th century, with all sorts of interventions being made. Eventually, yes, it's bought as a going concern, as an entity, and then people start to look at it archaeologically. But by that point, it's barely recognisable as a castle because it has been turned into a 19th century model farm. So you've got to use that skill, that training, to try and explain how we go from what's there now to what was there. So I think we're relatively safe from AI, but as I say, when I look at the AI results, they're absolutely hopeless because they just regurgitate the kind of common knowledge, received knowledge. And it's that kind of storytelling, myth making that I encounter all of the time from actual human beings as well. But it's AI is only as good as the information that's fed into it. And as a direct result of there being lots of folklore about ancient buildings and folk stories about ancient buildings, that's what AI tends to regurgitate.
Picking up on castles and possible myths. Some years back in the early 2000s, I was employed by, well, our company was employed by English Heritage to do condition surveys. And I ended up doing Burr Castle in Norfolk, which is a Roman fort. And of course, that's all flint with some brick in it as well. Very interesting. Then I did Framlingham, which was great. And then I did Berkhamsted. Now, that's where the myth comes in. So Berkhamsted, I get there, and the custodian meets me, and I'm looking round, and of course, what you see today is a load of flint work, and that's about it. And I'd already gathered, I thought this isn't what the castle would have looked like. I think this would have been clad in stone. I was just thinking that. And so the custodian comes over and I was chatting to him and he said, oh, yeah, he said, all you're looking at is the core of the walls. He said, because back in the 17th, 18th century, the owner nicked all the stone to build his local mansion. And he said, so if you go to the local mansion, that's where the stone from the castle came from. And so I never did, I didn't have the chance to research it, but it's that sort of thing, it goes back to the history. And that brings me, in fact, to another point I wanted to raise with you. It'd be interesting to hear your view on this. I found over the years, when I've been looking at when changes occur to buildings, when there have been an extension, an alteration, or what have you, it nearly always coincides with a change of ownership or something, an insurge of money coming in. The family suddenly got, or as you just said, they've died out and it's changed hands. So part of the research I've always suggested to people, and I may be wrong, but in my own amateur little way, part of the research I've always said, look at the ownership of the building, because that'll give you a clue as to when things might have happened. Is that something you would also agree, or do you think there's a better way of looking at it?
I think it's one way of looking at it, and certainly when I have been asked to do these kind of archival trawls to understand the change in ownership, to understand the people that have lived there, what you're essentially looking at is the human energy which may have led to changes to the property. We should not necessarily think about these in quite an abstract way, that buildings don't construct themselves. They are built as a direct result of human need and human energy and human alteration. So what is built as one thing does not necessarily mean that it's going to be that in 400 years' time. Of course, I gave the example there of Greasley Castle, which went from a very posh castle all the way down to quite a ramshackle farm. And you look at the human story to explain when those watershed moments are in the history of a property. But that can happen as well with much smaller domestic properties as well. That although it's more difficult to construct the archival history of non-elite buildings, often there's very little there. Certainly before the later 18th century, it's quite unusual to get any historical reference. And in fact, I did a property in Lancashire where the landowners really wanted the archival history, and I could not find a single reference to this building before the 20th century. It's like it did not exist. And yet, in reality, it was a mid-17th century property. So there, the archaeology had to speak. But when the archives do talk, I think, yes, you're quite right. There are all sorts of moments in the known history of a property when you can see that what is going on within the family leads to changes in the architecture. And as you quite rightly say, it can be an influx of money where somebody's married very well, or they've got a new job, or they've had a promotion, or something like that. Sometimes it's a little bit more bittersweet. So I looked at a property in Southall, which is in Nottinghamshire, and I looked at that just before 2019, I think, this property when I looked at that. And it was really of two phases. There was a phase in the sort of third quarter of the 18th century, and then something else had occurred in the second quarter of the 19th century. And the two phases were very, very distinct from one another. And I was able to work out that there'd been a marriage just before this fairly sizable extension had gone on. And I think the implication here is that although the marriage didn't necessarily bring lots of money to the property, I think there was an expectation that there would be a lot of children. And so they built the extension as the nursery to house all of these expected children. And the reason I say it's bittersweet is because that couple remained childless. Very tragically, very sadly, they did not have any children, but they still did then have the big extension. So sometimes it's in the expectation of something happening, which of course then does not happen. So the family circumstances can be quite important in understanding the changes to a property. I think it's worth mentioning as well that one of the ways that historically buildings have been dated is where you get those date stones or carved timbers with dates on them. Again, that's something we have to be a little bit careful of, because there has always been the assumption that date stones and date plaques and the like are tantamount to construction. And sometimes they are. They absolutely are. But you have to look at those with regard to other elements of the building. And it's almost like you then have to triangulate and then prove that that's the constructional date. You can't take it in and of itself, because those date stones can go in for all sorts of reasons, and a lot of those are to do with changes in family circumstances. So sometimes they can represent a sale or an inheritance or the birth of children or a death or something which the family thought was important politically, either locally, regionally, or nationally, or even internationally. And you never know what the case is there. Also, they can be moved around. So I've seen them where they've been taken from one building and put into another building. And I saw that in a property in Berkshire a few years ago, where there was a date stone of 1588, but it was inserted into a brick building that went up in about 1800. But again, just iterating the importance here that those date stones often represent changes in family circumstances, and those changes in family circumstances can be linked to construction or even deconstruction, of course. That happens too. But we always have to be a bit careful. But the overriding point that I think I would like to make is the one I made at the beginning, is that buildings don't just grow organically. They are there and they are changed as a direct result of human need and agency.
So with the date stones, it sounds a bit like when you're trying to sell a second-hand car and you put a 54 plate 54 plate on a sort of 2000 or something. Yeah, a little bit naughty, I suppose, in terms of doing that, but yeah, trying to make it more valuable.
Well, there is one class of building where we can see that playing with the dating very, very commonly, and that's pub history, which,
of course,
as you know, is something that I've looked in quite a lot, and I mention it in the Mythbusting book.
Yep.
But I don't know of a single pub anywhere in the country at all which has an accurate date painted on its sign. They all tend to be
a lot of comments on here, and all sorts of people are going to, I'm sure, going to get in from the audience, going to say, "Oh, well, my pub's different."
But they all tend to be much older than the reality, and as a rule of thumb, I'm usually ticking off about 4 or 5 centuries in age. So if it claims to date to the 12th century, it's generally a 17th or 18th century pub. So we have to be very careful because antiquity does often indicate status for something
and value. I guess, yeah,
exactly, yeah. So we have to be a bit careful with the dating of buildings. The other way round to look at this as well, in that there is quite often misdating of another kind. It's in the listings of buildings, so the legal listing documents. Because of the way that they were created, particularly for non-elite buildings in the 1960s and 1980s, which is where lots of timber-framed dwellings and then latterly farm buildings are brought in and listed. They're being done quite quickly in advance of those demolitions which were occurring throughout the middle of the 20th century. So the implication there is that listing inspectors were being sent out to rapidly survey what they thought were significant buildings. In some cases, they miss buildings which they should possibly have captured in the data. In others, the listings just describe the street frontage and the date is sort of assigned, fairly arbitrarily. A lot of them simply say, 17th century. But in reality, when I actually spend a bit more time and go into the building and spend a day looking at them, I reckon probably 60% of the time that the building will actually turn out to be older than the listing, because the evidence possibly wasn't there when they looked very quickly for 10 minutes in the street frontage. So dating a building and the myths about the dating of buildings is a very murky world, actually, because some people are deliberately making out that the buildings are older than they actually are. And then when you look at the listings, because of the nature of how that data was captured, sometimes it looks as if the building is actually younger than it really is. So there's all sorts of problems when you try and get to the date of a structure.
And you mentioned deconstruction of buildings. I come from East London originally, near Wanstead, and back in the day, Wanstead House was said to be one of the grand Palladian houses. It was built in the 18th century, but in the 19th century, it was bought up by a developer who demolished it. It goes back to reuse of buildings. That developer then developed most of Wanstead. And you will find bits of Wanstead House scattered in various Victorian houses throughout Wanstead. So you could be looking at a terraced house in Wanstead, for example, and come across a door and think, oh, that's a very posh door. It's totally misleading as to the date of the building because that door came out of Wanstead House. And so the reuse of elements, I mean, in a way, they were much more sustainable back in the day than we are. They were very keen to reuse bits. You see paneling taken out of one building, put in another, bits and pieces used all over the place. And so it was quite common to reuse. And that must be another area that can confuse when we're trying to date these buildings. And I'm sure you've come across many things like that. And I totally agree on the listing. I've only done it once, but I got a building delisted because it was said to be 17th century cottage, and I proved it was built in the 1920s. It just shows how unreliable the list descriptions are.
The point you made about the reuse of buildings is one that we or reuse of bits of buildings is one that we do see very, very, very frequently. Obviously, I've mentioned that can be problematic with regard to dendrochronology, and Rich has already pointed out that the date of some of the timbers in his house are probably reused. So it tells you about the original structure, not their current incarnation. And you mentioned panelling going walkabout. I did a survey in Lincolnshire a few weeks back, and this was a property which I'm absolutely convinced dated to the period 1700 to 1720. That was largely based on the very, very specific design of the staircase, which was in situ, and the format of the building was bob on for early 18th century. Yet in its dining room, it had panelling which had been taken from quite a smart property, which probably dated somewhere around the second half of the 16th century and first half of the 17th century. So that had come from somewhere really quite smart. And that happens quite a bit. Now, we can spot that archaeologically. We know what we're looking for reused bits of buildings, and particularly reused timbers stand out a mile with their relict mortise holes and unused peg holes and all that kind of thing. Of course, a lot of people assume that means it's come from a ship, which we now know it happens in a really seldom amount of times. I think pretty much every timber frame building I've ever looked at, somebody has claimed that it's built of ship timbers. But unless you're right on the coast, unless you've got really good archival evidence or really good archaeological evidence, it's probably not true. Nevertheless, the reuse of building materials has been happening since time immemorial. We can certainly see that in the building accounts of properties as well, where they survive. And of course, they're from elite buildings. But my own PhD is on Tattershall Castle, which is a great big brick structure in the Lincolnshire Fens, or just on the edge of the Lincolnshire Fens. And yet there, despite this being a really posh redevelopment in a massive scale by the Lord Treasurer of England, Ralph Cromwell, despite that, they were still buying timber-framed properties from Revesby Abbey, which is about 10 miles away, and transporting the timber to Tattershall to incorporate in the building work. And I've seen that elsewhere with regard to royal building projects, where the Palace of Clipston in Sherwood Forest, they relocated some agricultural buildings in the early 14th century from a kind of a fortified farm across 3 miles across a deer park and put them up within the palace itself. Sometimes this relocation of material is being done for very clear political purpose as well. During the Edwardian conquest of Wales in the late 13th century, Edward I was making deliberate decisions to take the halls of his defeated enemies, the princes of Gwynedd, and actually moving their hall houses, timber framed, lock, stock and smoking barrel, and putting them within his castles. Now, there's no bigger statement of conquest,
you're right,
taking the house of your defeated enemy and putting it within your much bigger, more impressive stone house. So there's all sorts of reasons why buildings or bits of buildings move around. And it's not necessarily that kind of recycling. Yes, there's a large element of that. That usually speaks, though, of a diminishment in financial reserves, but not always.
So for the amateur archaeologist or even the homeowner, with all this going on with their old building of all sorts of reused bits and bobs from wherever they, for whatever reasons, where do you start? With trying to understand your building. Is it the archives? Is it understanding the building? Is it dendrochronology? Where would you advise someone like me as a homeowner to say, how can I get an understanding of this building? Possibly even before getting a professional involved, to get a bit more a feel for it, if you see what I mean.
Well, I think that start small. Don't expect to become, the world's foremost buildings archaeologist by the end of the weekend. It takes people a long time to train to do this job, and you have to get a lot of experience and see a lot of different buildings. So when I say start small, go and buy or download some basic books on the subject, depending on what type of house you've got. Obviously, going and buying a John Goodall's book, The English Castle, is only going to work if you just bought a massive castle. But for most people who've just bought a timber frame building and want to start to understand something of its makeup, something of its context, buying books such as Richard Harris's book, published by Shire, Discovering Timber Frame Houses, which still remains the principal text that everybody should have, whether you're an expert or not. It's a great, great, great introduction to timber frame buildings. You could then build upon that when you've got a knowledge of the terminology and the plan forms and the like, to then getting some of the books by Ronald Brunskill, which came out in the 80s and 90s.
I actually did a little video, and it's on YouTube, of the books of Ronald Brunskill. But not only Richard Harris's book, but the Shire books generally, they're great. They're cheap, but they're a great starter. There's a whole load of them, aren't there?
They're always written by the principal expert in the field, whether it be lead work or architectural ceramics, cob walling, whatever it is. Like, it's going to be written by a good person, and they don't tend to exceed sort of 9,000 or 12,000 words. So you can read them in a couple of hours and get a good level of knowledge. I would also recommend Linda Hall's book, of course, Period Fixtures and Fittings, which should really be everyone's Bible. I never go anywhere on site without it in my bag. And there you are able to date things like doors, windows, fireplaces, staircases, paneling, and you can sort of put all of the constituent fixtures of your building together to help you to date, if not the actual structure, but the various elements of the building. And that shows you how these bits of buildings change over time from the 14th century up to the 19th century.
But given what we said just a second ago, being careful to aggregate all of those different features and not positioning it on just the one, because that could absolutely be from the building that was down the road.
Yeah, you have to be careful. It's all about triangulation. It's about building up a weight of evidence. It's not good enough to just simply say, well, that door over there is 18th century, so the house must be 18th century. That's dangerous. Right. Although there is one time where I've done that. Okay. I was asked to look at a house in Cambridgeshire, and there was one element to this brief, and that the landowner wanted to know how old the core of the house was. We knew that it had been extended and remodeled in the 30s. He wanted to know how old is this bit of it, which is the oldest part. And there was literally nothing left. Everything had been ripped out, so it was just some bricks, but I couldn't even clearly see the bricks because they'd all been rendered and painted and the like. So it was like, well, how old is this thing? And I went up into the roof, and the roof was untouched. And the roof, although it had nothing which was particularly diagnostic, it was just a simple A-frame roof. It was made of softwood, so it was made of a pine or something like that, which would tend to indicate the 18th or 19th century. And then it had one door surviving up in the attic, and that was an 18th century door. So I was able to say with some qualification that this person's house probably dated to the 18th century, but there wasn't a lot to go on. And sometimes that is the case. Sometimes you do come away from a property saying, well, there's only so much that we can say about this one. But in terms of advice, once you've kind of got an idea of the basics of the history of houses, of the archaeology of houses, then you can start to look at some of the data that's referring to your property in particular. Now you've got the context, the framework to hang the information on, and see what's been written about it. See if anyone's looked at it before. And of course, if it's listed, you've got the listing description with the caveat that it might be incorrect. But as long as you know that the listings are not always good, but you can go and check them, does the listing actually match what's there? You can see if someone like Nicholas Pevsner, did it catch his eye on his grand tour of the British Isles? Did he write about it? As any other architectural historian written about it? Are there any reports available online? As an archaeologist already looked at the house, and quite often these grey literature reports can be hiding away. So have a look on the Heritage Gateway for the county, contact the local historic environment record, ask the simple question, has anyone ever looked at this property before? See what they've made of it. Has a dendrochronologist looked at it? Look on the vernacular architecture tables, which are there county by county, and in fact date by date. So that's all available. So there's all sorts of repositories where information might be hiding about your building. And you probably don't even need to leave your living room and your laptop to get at most of that information. Now, of course, sometimes there might be stuff hiding away in the archives. So yes, go and have a look at that. Go and have a look at all of the sequence of mapping. You might get lucky, and it might be one of those parishes where you've not just got the Ordnance Survey and you can follow back the regression of the maps, you can follow back the changes in the shape of your property. You might be able to get back through the tithe maps, the enclosure maps, which will put you into the 18th century. There might be estate maps if it's been part of a big country estate. There might be maps which go back into the 17th or even the 16th century, but it would be unusual to get much further back than that. There are all sorts of routes into this, but the more sort of complicated you want to go, the deeper the level of the knowledge. At that point, you're probably thinking, well, we might need to call in the specialists. And even myself, when it comes to archival research, although I can do it up to a point, when it comes to the real weightier stuff, and when I'm talking weighty, I mean going way back into the medieval or the early modern period, I will always call in a colleague, because I don't have paleography skills for reading handwriting, and I don't have Middle English or Latin or any of those languages either. So it's always knowing your limitations. When you've reached a certain point and you can't possibly get back any further, then think about calling in a specialist. And again, we don't tend to cost that much, but it just depends on the budget. It depends whether or not you really want to access that information going back as far or as deep as you want.
One resource that I've used quite frequently is British History Online, because they've got the whole Victoria County histories, and I think they've got Morant, so they've certainly got the commission's writings and things like that. So that, and we'll put some links up. I mean, some of the things we've discussed, we'll make sure that with the show notes, we'll put the links and what have you. But British History Online, I found a useful resource as well at times. We mentioned books a minute ago, and a lot of people, I mean, even this morning there was a post on one of the Facebook groups, how do I research the history of my house? And everyone just wades in with, well, you could look here. And of course, the person's left thinking, well, where do I start? And I think what you've said is very helpful. We've talked about the Shire books and other books. None of the problem I find with a lot of these books is they give you examples. They don't always show you exactly what you want to see. And so you've got to extrapolate from that. And that's where you come in, is helping people to understand, is that relevant, is it not relevant, so on and so forth.
But even under those circumstances, there are situations where I will see something and be a little bit bamboozled or stumped. Only last week I surveyed a property in Somerset where I saw some bridging beams in the property that had really unusual stops at their ends, and they were playing card designs: clubs, spades, hearts, and diamonds. And I'd never seen anything like that anywhere at all. And I was able to pop those up to other experts and say, hey, have you ever seen anything like this? And literally not another single specialist in vernacular architecture had ever seen anything like it. But that becomes important, because even amongst our own community, we've been able to identify that this is potentially unique and therefore of really quite high significance. So I'm able to go back to the client and say, well, I can't find a parallel for this. There literally isn't one like this anywhere else in the country. Wow, that's quite a big moment. Obviously, now it is known about. So if one does pop up again, we can sort of have that discussion. But it's just to sort of say that even when one has become a specialist or an expert, or someone that feels quite comfortable in their own skin within their own discipline, you will still get those moments where something completely unusual turns up that you've never seen, that you can't necessarily explain.
Could that be someone modern day carving something just because they were a bit bored, and then that throws off the archaeology completely out in terms of, oh, we found something really significant and fantastic here? I don't know.
In terms of the playing card stops to the chamfers on the bridging beams, the context of them was quite clear, namely that they had been created for that space at point of construction, because there was simply no way of creating them after the fact,
Gotcha.
if you like. It would have required a huge amount of work. Also, it would have been quite difficult to do because the carpenter would not really have had room to drive the mallet into the chisel because of the presence of the wall so close. So it would have actually been a really difficult thing to cut.
Could that be what you just mentioned? I touched on it in your CV at the beginning. Medieval graffiti.
With regard to the study of graffiti or mark making, it's really important to always understand the context and to understand that no one mark is necessarily going to be the answer to all of them. So just because you've seen one thing in one building does not mean that that's exactly the same interpretation that you would make in a second building. But it's about building up, again, a confidence about what you are looking at. Now, there's all sorts of marks that are made in buildings, but I suppose the one that I've looked at in the most detail myself, or rather, there's a few that I've looked at, but one that I'm choosing to speak about now, are these burn marks, which are found in buildings, which are abundantly common. They're tear-shaped, they're palpably, clearly created by a naked flame, and they're blackened scorches on the wall. Some of them can be quite big, up to about a foot in height. Some of them only a few millimeters in height. Some of them very, very deep. Some of them very, very shallow, and all combinations of them. Sometimes we find clusters of them in particular areas of these buildings. The first point to make about this mark making is it is hugely common. And it's very, very difficult for me to think of any building that I've looked at which went up before really the middle of the 18th century, which don't have these things on them. And as a result of just how common they are in historic buildings, it was for a long period of a time assumed that they were created by accidental candle burns. That a candle had tipped over or a taper had tipped over and accidentally burned the building. Because the one thing we all know about the past is that it was very dim at night, and they had naked flames and light. So you can kind of understand how that story might have grown up. And for decades, that was good enough. That was the explanation for these really common marks, until gradually people started to look at the evidence and realize from experiments and from archaeological observations that we're finding these in some really weird places, that there's no evidence for how candles or tapers could have been mounted. And then actually from an experimental point of view, realizing that to create this very characteristic tear-shaped burn, one had to hold a candle or a taper or a rushlight at an angle of 45 degrees, very, very still for lengthy periods of time. We're talking kind of 10, 20 minutes. And so it was evidence of deliberate human behavior. And actually, when you left the candle unattended, it leaves this great big wide, long linear burn or a big amorphous blob. And what it doesn't do is create that very discrete tear shape. And so using folklore, using Christian writings, using folk songs, using a whole bunch, again, to triangulate the evidence, a whole bunch of evidence together, it's been widely realized that these things were a result of people burning their properties essentially to drive away the things that go bump in the night. There was the idea that the evil spirits or the demons or witches were coming to get you, and they wanted to set fire to your property. So you burn your building a little bit, almost like a decoy, to say, well, this one's been done. You don't need to bother. You don't need to bring down the thunderstorm with the lightning to set fire to my property. This has already been done. And this was quite a lengthy tradition that went on from certainly the 13th century and was still occurring as late as the 1870s, although there does seem to be a real peak in the early modern period. So it's kind of looking at mark making, understanding its context, understanding its kind of history and development, and maybe not just going for the immediate knee-jerk reaction of, well, it's just an accidental candle burn, because it's far from it. But nevertheless, there are some people out there that get incredibly angry anytime I talk about that one and will not have it, that the evidence has actually been pulled together and it's now kind of overturned the original assumptions which were being made, I think, quite carelessly previously and almost dismissively, because this is such a, well, it was seen at the time as being quite arcane and esoteric, but now we're understanding the psychologies and emotions of people in the past and understanding that these fears were really quite abundant, and so that they wanted to protect themselves. And it's understanding the context of the time that's important. So mark making in all of its forms is rarely just the graffiti of boredom. Rarely, rarely, rarely. There is usually something else behind it. Not in all cases, but by understanding the context, you can understand what's going on in someone's mind when they are actually marking up a building.
Just to pick up on the myths and to bring us back to your book, I totally agree with you about ships. I think in nearly 40 years of surveying, I think I've twice seen buildings where there are clearly ship's timbers in them. And I totally agree with you. Back in the day, and it was probably in the 90s, I recall going to see a talk by Oliver Rackham. And I remember him saying something to the effect, and I may have got this wrong, but him saying that he thought, I've looked in his books and I can't see it written down, so forgive me if I've misunderstood this, but I recall him saying something to the effect that back in the day, the Navy wanted the best quality timbers. So they went round identifying what they needed and what they wanted and basically saying, we want to use that timber, so you're not allowed to use it for anything else. But later on, saying, actually, we don't need it anymore. So you can now use it. So the myth arose, I'm told, and I may be wrong, by the fact that people were using timbers that had been earmarked for ships, but weren't used for that. So therefore, hence, we've used ships' timbers. They weren't. They had been earmarked. Is there any credence in what I've just said, or have I completely misunderstood what he was getting at, or have I just misrepresented him? I don't know.
I've read Oliver's book, The History of the Countryside, from end to end. It's several times. It's a fascinating read. It holds up really very well. It came out nearly 40 years ago now, but it's still the standard text, and it still works very well. There's not too many criticisms of it. I can't speak for Oliver as to whether or not that's truly what he said. I've certainly not encountered that within his writings, but it is something that comes up a lot when I discuss ship timbers in lectures or online or whatever the format is, that comes up as a comment that it's sort of marine grade timber. However, there's sort of two ways to tackle this question. The first way is sort of head on, and that's that we know quite a lot about the supply of the British Navy. And they were given specific woodlands that were theirs, and that they had to therefore manage, and that they had to encourage the cyclical regrowth before actually considering felling. In the New Forest, you can go down there, and on a lot of beech trees, which are of sufficient antiquity, you will find that broad arrow mark. And I've photographed this quite widely, where you've got the kind of the arrow mark like that, and you can see that, and that has been allocated by the Navy for use for the Navy, but that's in their own woodland, and the Navy's woodlands tended to be those former royal deer parks, former royal hunting reserves, such as the New Forest. That's where they were getting their timber from, but other people didn't necessarily have any rights to that timber, so it wasn't necessarily the Navy saying, well, you can't cut down that tree, we're having that one, because nobody else really had the right to that. Sometimes licenses were given from the royal parks for building projects on other estates, or even for other manors, to rebuild properties. But in the instance where the Navy has access to the woodlands, that is theirs. They're not in competition with anybody else. Now, one of the things that Rackham does say in his book is that the Navy was pretty appalling at woodland management. And there was a lot of mismanagement of the timber, so they were forever quite short of it. And there was also rather a lot of corruption and embezzlement as well. So the Navy is forever moaning about the shortage of timber. And yet the private shipyards are not making those same complaints, because they're dealing with other sources and it's being managed in a much better way. And that archaeologically and historically, we can kind of spot that there isn't really a kind of a lack of timber, good quality building timber, which might necessitate the use of ship timbers, decommissioned ship timbers or reclaimed timbers in land buildings until the end of the 18th century, which is being brought about as a result of the predations of the Industrial Revolution, which does really advance the felling of oak at that period of time. So you can sort of approach it that way. So that kind of explains the second point that I wanted to make, essentially, that there wasn't really a need for this use of ship timbers, because there was this sort of cyclical regrowth, and it wasn't until really the industrial era where there was a very slight uptick in the use of ship timbers, and that can be seen archaeologically. And I know that Stephen said that he's only seen this happen 2 or 3 times in 40 years, and I've seen it about the same in 25 years. So I've seen it on one of my own surveys only once, for sure, and that was 4 timbers in a property in Whitby. They were the futtocks, which are the principal ribs of the keel of a ship, and they were being reused as two as door lintels, one as a fireplace bracket, and one as a collar in a roof structure. And of course, Whitby, with its famous history of ship building and ship breaking, you only had to open the window of this cottage, and there was Whitby Harbour. So it hadn't come too far, but it was very clear from the context of the finds that they were there from the 18th century. And the other occasions, Andy Moyer, who was mentioned earlier, the dendrochronologist, had identified a reused timber as a tie beam in a barn at Waxham in Norfolk, and I went along and had a look at that as part of the research for my book, and I agree with Andy. I think what he'd seen there was a ship's mast. It still had tar on it and rope marks and all that kind of thing, and it was clearly an 18th century insertion into a 16th century building. And then more recently, earlier this year, I saw again what looked like a futtock reused as a couple of door jambs, but this was in Leicestershire, and this made no sense at all. So I was scratching my head about this one, and I didn't want to lead my client on in great hope that they got a ship timber in the middle of Leicestershire. So I sneakily sent a photograph to my friend Damien Goodburn, who's an expert on historic carpentry and boat building. His PhD's on boat building in the medieval period. And I thought, if anyone's going to know, it's going to be Damien. And he came back and he went, yeah, I see your problem here, because it does look like a futtock, but it's in Leicestershire. And he said he couldn't even be certain that it was a futtock. What he thought it could have been is it could have come from a barge or even from a mill wheel. So sometimes we might have these issues as well. But again, they're not used that often. And when they are, it tends to be quite late. But there was a bit of a fad for the use of ship timbers in the early 20th century when they were breaking up the last of the tall ships, and architects thought it would be quite a romantic thing to incorporate them into these sort of pastiche timber frame buildings. So you get things like the captain's cabin from HMS Ganges bolted onto the back of the Burr Island Hotel as the restaurant, and Liberties of London, including timbers from a couple of warships which were broken up as well. So there's a bit of a fad for it, and I think that leads people to think that it was more common in the past too.
I mean, one of the examples I've seen was actually by a canal. There was a waterway there. There was an explanation for it, but yeah.
They're pretty common in port environments. So the Port of London, lots and lots and lots of ship timbers reused in the river wall of the Thames, for example. Incredibly common finds, but it makes sense given the context.
Yeah, I mean, here in Gloucester, of course, all the canal barges and everything else. I mean, my house is full of them.
Okay, so thanks very much, James. That's been fascinating talking to you. But as we come to the end of this podcast, one of the things we ask our guests is to talk about their favourite book or a book they would recommend. Now, obviously, we would recommend your book here. So we're going to plug that for you. So we've both got it here. But apart from your own book, what book would you recommend people, or what have you found most useful in your career?
Well, I mean, it's a book I mentioned earlier when we were talking about how one starts to build up knowledge about historic buildings, and one that I said had been absolutely invaluable and goes everywhere with me on site, and it is indeed Linda Hall's Period Fixtures and Fittings, 1300 to 1900. This book goes literally on site with me. It's why it's so dog-eared. It's covered in annotations, but it is just absolutely invaluable because it contains information that I just can't hold in my head. You know, I can't be expected to know the typology of staircase balusters from the medieval period all the way through. It's not the sort of thing that you can hold in your head, but fortunately somebody else has held it in her head and has reproduced it using beautiful, brilliant, clear illustrations and very concise text, so that you can simply look through it. You can think, well, I've got a door, well, it looks such and such, well, can I find an example in the beautiful drawings here? Then, oh, look, that's exactly like the door that I'm looking at. Oh, it looks like it's 17th century. And then you go to the text and you look in there, and it'll explain to you the context of those doors, how they develop out of something else and develop into something else. So absolutely invaluable for all of the bits of buildings. I'm generally good on the larger scale thing, and roof structures and plan forms, but this gives you the real minutiae of windows and doors and fireplaces and the like, and it goes literally everywhere with me. But it's so accessible and easy to use, and well written and well illustrated, that you don't have to be a specialist to use and enjoy this book at all. So Linda Hall's Period Fixtures and Fittings.
I've got it on my shelf here as well. Totally agree with you.
Thanks, James. And for the benefit of those watching on YouTube, you'll get to see all the picture of that book. And for everyone else listening on podcast, all the details of that will be in the show notes, so we can go and look it up for yourself afterwards. The other question we asked many people is about, and for someone like yourself, James, who's been to many, many buildings, incredible buildings of lots of different age, from very large castles to small cottages, like you said, which one's your favourite? And ideally, which one's your favourite that people can visit and see for themselves?
I mean, it's a very straightforward question for me, this, because the answer has not really changed in the last decade or so, and it's a building that I've referred to already. It's Knoll, the great country house in Kent near Sevenoaks, which, very quick potted history of it, was originally constructed for another Lord Treasurer of England, James Fiennes. He managed to get his head cut off in the Jack Cade Rebellion in 1450, at which point the site, which is incomplete at this point, is sold to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Bullshire, and he kind of puts the floors in and puts the roof on, and then gradually starts expanding in it, and it gets absolutely enormous. There's kind of, by the end of his life in 1486, there's 3 courtyards to this house, but then people start adding more to it, and there's another huge building phase in about 1500 for Archbishop Warham. And then it goes through various landowners throughout the 16th century until another Lord Treasurer, in fact, Thomas Sackville, takes on the property at the beginning of the 17th century. And there's a massive overhaul of this site in the first decade of the 17th century, which leads to huge changes in all sorts of ways. And all of these changes have left their architectural clues. And as a result, this building is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most complex. As I've said already, it's one of the largest and certainly the most complex of buildings archaeology that I've ever encountered. I still don't fully understand the structure. There's still a lot of clues which remain hidden, which in fact may never be revealed or even be still there to be revealed. Every time I look at the building or a bit of the building, new bits of information come flying out of literally the woodwork. And it's just one of those sites that's completely got under my skin. Unfortunately, I haven't been asked to do any work there for about 18 months or so, but it was one of those projects that just refused to die. I just kept being asked to go back and, can you look at this range? Can you look at that range? Can you look at the roof here? Can you look at the cellar down there? And I pulled all this together as best as I can in my head, but it's one of those properties that it would be a tremendous thing to bring it all together in a solid, chunky monograph on the site. But whether or not the National Trust will ever commission such a thing, I can't comment on. But that's the building that has, I think, infected me the most in all sorts of ways.
Love it. So we were talking before about the amateur building archaeologist. Probably not your starter building then, you would suggest.
But for the starter building, if you do want to go and see what your old Hall house might have looked like, timber frame building, get yourself to these architectural museums like Avencroft or St Fagans or the Wealden Downland and go and see these buildings presented in living museum format, because it will help you to understand what your structure looks like at its heart, at its core, before all of those later interventions have been inserted. Because what they've tended to do is strip them back to their original format. So take out all of the later floors, take out the chimneys, all of those later accretions that have gone in, and present them as they were actually originally built. Not in all cases, it must be said, but that is for your amateur building sleuth, that's another place that you might, or group of places that you might consider going to.
I was recently at the Chiltern Open Air Museum for the Carpenters Fellowship weekend.
Fantastic.
And they had a mock Viking raid.
How very authentic.
And I can tell you, most of the members of the Carpenters Fellowship, you couldn't tell the difference between them and the Vikings. That's another great facility as well.
I'm a bit less about the pillaging and burning of ancient properties, though.
That's true. Right, well, as we wrap up, I think our listeners and viewers would be very interested to know how they might contact you. Now, you've got a website. Now, I'm probably going to get the pronunciation wrong.
Would you like me to do it for you?
Yes, you do it for us.
I run a consultancy called Triskelly Heritage, and we do building surveys, historic building surveys. I also do outreach lectures, both in person and online. I do broadcasting, TV, radio, and of course podcasts, and of course lots of writing as well. And those are the 4 strands of the business.
And so people can reach you by going on your website and seeing what you're up to and reaching out to you from there. And at the moment, I know this podcast will hopefully be around for a long time. At the moment, you've just brought out the book that we keep referring to, and you're doing a series of tours associated with that. So if they go on your website, they can see where you're at next to come and see you live, and perhaps your book, get the book signed by you.
Yeah, the book came out in June. It seems to be doing pretty well. We're already on the 3rd reprint, so it's been some demand for it. And as I said before, historic building mythbusting, it looks at these commonly received and believed stories and tries to get under the skin of the folklore to explain where those stories come from and why we believe them. And yeah, it's proved one of those things where I've had the opportunity to do this book tour. So starting in June, I set off, did a summer tour. I'm now in the second half of the autumn 2024 tour, and in 2025 I'll be going out and doing another 30 or 40 dates as well. Generally, I'm getting all over the country, from Glasgow down to Pevensey and from Plymouth across to Norwich. There's still a few pockets of areas where I haven't been able to get a date, but generally I'll be coming within 20 miles of most people.
Thank you ever so much for your time, James. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.